So let's start with the Sabian symbol, and it's kind of an interesting one. So it's an old-fashioned woman or a conservative woman and an up-to-date girl, and really it's kind of talking about this idea of where the past and the future sort of intersect. And I think it's so interesting because back in May we talked about kind of the of youth versus old age in terms of the two Mercuries. You know, Mercury as kind of the liminal figure of Mercury or sort of Hermes on one hand, and then Mercury Senex, which is considered to be Saturn. So it's interesting now that we're almost looking at the female version of this. And of course, that's always kind of very loaded culturally, this idea of, you know, sort of the aging woman versus the sort of the younger girl. And you know, traditionally we can get into these stereotypes of, you know, kind of the maiden and the crone, if you like. And I think really what it's kind of saying is that we need to sort of look at, you know, challenging modernism versus conservatism and learning that there's kind of benefits to both, and learning how the two things can kind of work together. So it's where the past and the future intersect, so where history and the future sort of intersect. And I love this quote by Ellen Glasgow, which is, no idea is so antiquated that it was not once modern, and no idea is so modern that it will not someday be antiquated. So really kind of poking fun at this idea of, you know, kind of the older generation having nothing to offer on one hand, and then youth being completely sort of, you know, impulsive and perhaps overconfident and sometimes a little bit unrealistic. So kind of it's blasting those stereotypes to an extent. And I think what I really love is there's that quote from Hamlet, I think, where he says there's nothing new under the sun. And I think that's really true, that there's certain aspects of human experience that is perennial. You know, it doesn't matter, excuse me, what culture, what generation, what century we're in. There's some things about the human experience that don't change. And I think this is where we can kind of look for commonalities to sort of move past this idea of the past and the future. You know, the time itself is a construct, and really all we have is this kind of eternal now, and that is really what links the past and the future. So it's a very interesting one, actually. Yes, I mean, in the Sabian Oracle we have a couple of ideas. I mean, on one hand it can be about coming to terms with the aging process. It can also be about learning experiences. You know, there's nothing quite like experience, to the wisdom of experience to sort of teach us things. And on the other hand, there's also this idea of, you know, when you're young, you are more confident and you're more willing to take risks and to sort of entertain the new, and that can be a good thing in the sense that it can kind of challenge the status quo, or move you out of kind of accepted norms or ways of doing things that might need refining or that might be a little bit kind of outdated. But it can talk about things like the generation gaps, or indeed of, as I say, this idea of particularly, you know, ideas about in our society about kind of older women and the aging process, and that's been quite prevalent, certainly in the UK. There's been quite a lot of news coverage around this idea of, for example, the menopause and how it's been really sidelined by the medical profession. A lot of women's health issues have, and you know, people have been saying for quite some months now that that really it's a kind of a travesty because it affects 50% of the population, and it's a direct reflection of the fact that medicine for so long was kind of male dominated, as was science, and that really there's a need to sort of move past these sort of issues and these kind of prejudices, and to sort of find a way to you know, to sort of move medicine into the 21st century. And part of that is helping women to to age well in the sense of health. You know, that with the decline of hormones, particularly estrogen, comes a lot of knock-on effects on the body, certainly from a kind of health perspective. And so it's actually to everyone's benefit for women to have better health, and that includes looking at their hormones. And of course, hormones are also a big factor in younger women. They are often, you know, what drive behavior, particularly around things like you know, they talk a lot about hormones like estrogen and how it tends to make women, you know, Dr. Christian North talks about this a lot in her books, about how estrogen makes women very compliant, and it makes them a lot more kind of sometimes willing to tolerate BS from men, or to sort of to be people pleasers, um, and that, you know, as women get to sort of menopausal age, they tend to be a lot less conformist. Actually, they tend to become quite rebellious and sort of like go, I'm not I'm not putting up with that BS anymore, that patriarchal BS, and become quite rebellious actually. So some people see the menopause as being a kind of a second, almost like a second transition that we experience, similar to going from puberty into into kind of womanhood. So it's quite an interesting one actually, and there are quite a lot of overlaps, that these two sort of rites of passage actually have a lot more in common than people realize. So I think it's about finding those kind of commonalities and negotiating this idea of whether we kind of need to let go of something that is outdated, a convention that's outdated, where we need to let our hair down. And it's interesting because one of the fixed stars that is highlighted is diadem, and that has to do with the hair of the Queen of Egypt, so Berenice. So there could be an element of letting go, having a good time, not kind of being a stick in the mud. And equally, it could be about respecting sort of the wisdom that older women bring. You know, the kind of the crone as the sort of the wise woman, the witch, who does actually have a lot to offer, and who's learned through bitter experience sometimes, particularly around things like you know, love and affairs of the heart, that can often offer younger women the benefit of their experience. So it's kind of interesting. And I think, you know, if we kind of look at this in the negative way, we can look at things like, you know, jealousy in terms of like, you know, all those kind of classic things of like the younger woman and the older woman, and supposedly how the younger woman can be jealous of the younger woman's looks and youth and all that kind of stuff. But equally, you know, there's this kind of idea of the younger woman projecting onto the older woman and saying, oh, she's sort of like an old witch, or you know, is kind of like a has-been, or, and it can often be about a fear of aging. You know, there's a lot in our culture that really values youth and doesn't really value sort of old age. But as I say, I don't think we should confine it just to sort of the feminine archetypes. I think it's also important to go back to some of those masculine archetypes that we saw in May, and we're going to look at a little bit at that because of key aspects between Mercury and Saturn. So as I was saying, it's interesting that at this particular new moon we've got Mercury and Saturn in opposition, and at the May Gemini, I think it was the new moon, I can't remember now, where I talked a lot about Mercury and Saturn and this idea of the youth or the orphan and kind of old age, you know, Mercury Senex. And you know, it's interesting now that they are moving from a square, which was what they were in kind of back then, to an opposition. So it's moving from the 90-degree angle to the 180-degree angle. So this is almost Mercury and Saturn in a straight line, but at two opposite ends of the same pole. And so I thought I'd kind of tease this out a little bit in terms of some themes. So on the one hand, if we think about Saturn, we're talking about what's classic, whereas Mercury is kind of the moment. So Saturn is about what's serious and kind of lasting, so things like classic novels, perennial wisdom, the timeless appeal of, you know, certain classics, if you like. You can think about that in terms of cars, you know, like the Jaguar E-Type, for example. You can think of that in terms of fashion, you know, kind of classic tailoring, how it's flattering no matter how, you know, kind of what age or stage, if you want to sort of create a sort of a timeless silhouette. And of course Saturn in the sense transcends flash and the pan schemes, things like memes, you know, and it stands the test of time. But of course it can be fuddy-duddy and slow to adapt, and so you have to kind of be careful of the sort of the crusty boomers, or the sort of, you know, the stereotypes about the crotchety old man or woman, somebody who's not willing to sort of entertain kind of more modern ways of doing things, that kind of thing. And then on the other hand, we've got Mercury. So Mercury can be quite exciting, like fashion or kind of certain trends. It can be quite fun and current. It can capture the zeitgeist, and politicians and sort of the media is very good at that, and that's why Mercury rules both of those things. But of course, on the other hand, it can be a little bit fickle. It can be opinion-based, entertainment-driven, like memes, jokes, all kind of things that trend on social media, or perhaps like, you know, jokes and storylines of kind of that are sort of fun, but don't necessarily have a kind of a deeper meaning. And both of these planets, even though they are very different, they are both kind of linked to time and to consciousness to an extent. So Mercury on the one hand is about what's new, what's current, so things like news, current affairs, politics, slang, which of course changes very rapidly, social media trends, this idea of modernity, the idea of invention, of moving forward. If you think about Mercury ruling transport and kind of cars, that kind of thing, vehicles. But it can also be about kind of, slick, fast-talking salesmen, dilettantes, so people that are kind of jacks of all trade, master of none. And then things like thieves and con artists on the other sort of end of the spectrum. Now, Saturn is considered to be a lot more serious, a lot more kind of pedantic and slow and gradual, so it tends to rule things like academia, science, and the scientific method, rigorous debate, serious or critical thinking, and this need to kind of test hypotheses. So remember I was saying, I was talking about critical thinking, and part of, this is very much part of the scientific or the academic rigor, is that you have to have, if you make an assertion, you have to back it up with facts. So in a way, it is about things that you can't argue with. So whereas a meme might not necessarily be true, or it might sort of only reflect something that's kind of flash in the pan, or it might even just be a joke. It might be based in rumor, for example. With Saturn, it needs to be based in fact, and it needs to be based in things like timeless truths, the law of nature, that kind of thing. So as I say, it's a lot more serious, but it lasts longer. So it takes a while for consensus to develop around, say, a particular theory or something like that. But it at the same time, once it's kind of solidifies, it's difficult to kind of top. It's that kind of energy. And that's why it's often associated with mastery. So with experts in certain subject areas, these are people that have studied for a long time, that know their subject area well, and that we shouldn't sort of, I suppose that, that this notion of an expert has become a little bit trivialized in the sort of the era of the kind of social media influencer, where everybody feels that they have to be an expert, or they have to pretend that they're an expert, when very often they aren't. And that there's nothing wrong with deferring to true experts, people that have studied in their field for, say, 20 years and that really know what they are talking about. And that there is a time and a place for those people. If you think about the pandemic and how important science was in actually, finding, ways to sort of deal with or kind of live with the pandemic, and for coming up with a vaccine and so on, that there is definitely, when it comes to those kind of things like medicine, you can't sort of talk rubbish. You can't kind of, you can only sort of like talk BS for so long, and then, it's not going to sort of amount to much. So I think there's something in that. And as I say, it's important, I think, at this new moon and over the 2 weeks that follow, to try and balance these two things out, because as we'll see, there is these two planets form like a part of a grand cross with each other and with several other planets. So I think that we're going to see these themes play out on this sort of the grander stage, if you like, and in our own lives in different ways. Not just at the new moon itself, but possibly over the fortnight that then kind of follows.